Metro News Talkline is presented by Encova Insurance, encircling you with coverage to protect what you care about most. Visit Encova.com to learn more.
Hour number 2, Metro News Talkline, 800-765-TALK is the phone number, 800-765-8255. You can text the show at 304-TALK-304. Jake Link is our video producer on Metro News Television, and Ethan Collins is running the phones and handling the audio side of things. Coming up, Montague County Delegate Gino Shirelli will join us at the bottom of the hour. Once again, say good morning to TJ Meadows. He's in the Charleston Bureau. Good morning, TJ.
Good morning, Dave. The private text line's going crazy.
Oh, it is.
People think I've lost my mind because I'm asking questions.
Well, they may not be far off. Gino will join us. He was one of those in attendance last night at the Charlie Kirk Vigil in Morgantown. We'll talk to him about last night's vigil and Kirk's influence on his political career coming up bottom of the hour. So one of the other conversations that's come out of this tragedy from last week is freedom of speech, First Amendment protected speech, because many people took to social media and posted their thoughts, which were celebratory in nature, to the death of Charlie Kirk, and they have lost their jobs because of that. They've been fired. They have been pointed out on social media. Robert Bolton is a political science professor at Fairmont State University. He and his students were having some of these very conversations yesterday about freedom of speech, about the Fifth Amendment, about whether or not that First Amendment, yes, I mentioned the Fifth, we'll get to that as well, but whether or not the First Amendment carries over to the workplace. All the above we will discuss. Robert Bolton joins us on Metro News Talkline this morning. Robert, good morning. Glad you can join us.
Good morning, Dave. Good morning, TJ. Always glad to be on.
I'm not even sure where to start this conversation because there's a broad take. I've seen some of the news networks have been talking about this. I guess just generally, what's your take as people went on social media and in many instances celebrated the death of Charlie Kirk and then were relieved of their jobs because of it?
Well, first and foremost, I think it goes without saying that celebrating anyone's death, especially someone who was not engaging in any type of violent activity, who was expressing his opinion on a college campus, I think that's personally a very shameful pattern of behavior if you're lauding or praising or celebrating his death. Whether or not you agree with Charlie Kirk or found some of his opinions odious, the fact of the matter is that was a man with a wife and with two very young children, at least one of whom I know was there and witnessed her father's murder. So in my opinion, it's incredibly poor taste to celebrate his death. But in regard to the employment aspect of it, yes, you've seen many people fired. When I was on Facebook just a few hours after his murder, it was making the rounds that there was an employee of West Virginia University who was basically celebratory about Mr. Kirk's death. And then there was a professor out of Middle Tennessee State University, I believe it was, who ended up being fired, or maybe she was a dean now that I'm thinking about, who ended up being fired. And I know that there have been calls for termination elsewhere throughout the United States.
Robert, is hate speech protected under the Constitution?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No questions about it. Again, this is part of the conversation I was having with my students yesterday. If you go to many different countries in Europe, Germany, for example, which obviously has a history of Nazism where during World War II its leadership engaged in genocide. Even today, engaging what some people might term hate speech, so denying the Holocaust, targeting particular ethnic groups or individuals because of their background, can result in criminal prosecution. When I was in law school, I actually had a roommate one year who was from Germany, and he one time remarked, somewhat flabbergasted, that he did not understand why in the United States we did not prosecute those individuals. He said, in Germany, we don't want anything like that to happen again. But no, in the United States, as a legal matter, there is no such thing as hate speech. in regard to criminal liability. If you denied the Holocaust, if you said you did not like a particular ethnic or religious group, or if you did not like an individual person, and that you generally hoped that they would die, that is protected. And my argument to my roommate back when I was in law school, and it's the same argument I have today, is look, there's a lot of odious speech out there, but you've got a constitutional right to be a jerk. And I would much rather someone who is, say, a neo-Nazi be able to express their views, even though I find them odious, rather than them attempt to conceal those views and fly under the radar. Because, again, even if it's criminalized, that doesn't mean someone's going to change their views. It just means they're going to be more subtle and by implication, more dangerous if they learn how to message in a careful way where they tiptoe around criminal liability.
Talking to Robert Bolton, political science professor at Fairmont State University. We know the First Amendment does not extend to private employers. If you say something, post something on social media that reflects poorly on your employer, could cost them business, they can get rid of you. They can get rid of you for that. What about public employees? That seems to be a trickier area.
It absolutely is a trickier area. Just one thing briefly about the private employers, about the only exception to that, because the vast majority of states and vast majority of employment situations, you're an at-will employee. So you can be terminated for any reason as long as it's not a few prohibited categories like protection of race. But there are some exceptions if, say, you had an employment contract or there were a few other situations. In regard to public employment, it becomes much more difficult because if you are working for the government, generally the Supreme Court has said that unless it causes a significant disruption in the workplace or imposes such an unfair burden on the government that they cannot effectively function, that you cannot be terminated just on the basis of your opinions. Now, if, say, for example, you were a law enforcement officer posting about politics during your work shift, you could potentially be sanctioned and even under some circumstances terminated if it's during your work hours. But outside of work hours, it's very, very difficult in order to terminate someone who is expressing their personal political views. Even among professors such as myself, if you are a tenured faculty member, you can say some pretty odious things both inside of the classroom and in your private life, and generally that's going to be protected. There are exceptions to it, there are limits to it, but compared to private employers, public employers are much more restricted in what they can sanction their employees over saying.
I'd like to read you a quote from Pam Bondi that's going around the internet, video that hit yesterday. She said, quote, "There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially what happened to Charlie in our society. We will absolutely target you, go after you, if you are targeting anyone with hate speech." What are your reflections on that quote?
Without knowing all of the broader content of her speech where she gave that or answered that question, I will say in general what I said a moment ago, that hate speech is not something that is criminally sanctionable in the United States. Now, that, again, doesn't mean that if you're a public employee, they may not review your employment record or your conduct on the job, and you may be inviting additional attention for yourself. But, and also in Mr. Kirk's case, the big difference is that it wasn't just speech. This poor man was murdered in front of thousands of people. That, by all means, please investigate the killer, and I hope that they prosecute him to the full extent of the law. But in regard to targeting, investigating, and prosecuting people, you have to generally pursue a very specific threat against someone. I'll use this as an example. Under federal law, it is a crime to threaten the life of the president. If you said in general, "I hope President X passes away," that is not something that will result in a criminal, or at least will not result in a successful criminal prosecution. If you said, on the other hand, "I am going to go out and attempt to shoot President X at the White House tomorrow, that would be something that you could be prosecuted potentially for. Now, the former example I gave of hoping that happens, that doesn't mean you're not going to get a very awkward visit from the Secret Service and they're going to check you out. That's definitely going to happen. Happens all the time. And the presidents, the last number I saw was, I think each president fields something like 10,000 threats per year. But the vast majority of these people are mentally ill and aren't really capable of organizing the threats, usually bluster in a bar or on the internet. But yeah, absolutely, you can be investigated for that. But is that going to result in a successful criminal prosecution if you just say, I hope in general someone passes away? Not a chance.
Robert Bolton joining us, Fairmont State University political science professor. More of a philosophical question to you, Robert. Several years ago, during the height of cancel culture, the conservatives, Republicans, the right were very critical of that. People who would post their political thoughts and could very well lose their job because of that. Is this the same thing, only on the other side this time?
Yeah, I hate to be a little bit cynical about it, but I do think it is a little bit of one-upsmanship by each side of the political aisle. I've said oftentimes in my classes that one thing I realized early in life that I wasn't God, and having a little bit of humility and recognizing that I've been wrong at certain points in my life and have changed my mind on certain issues. I wish more of the United States had that perspective. I wish that we were a little bit more understanding that we're all Americans and we're all in this together. And that, yeah, you know what, we all have the stereotypical drunk uncle at Thanksgiving who blathers on and you roll your eyes at their opinions. But maybe having a little bit of humility and recognizing, look, the idea of what I think Mr. Kirk was trying to get at, having an open conversation, having an open debate, and not trying to ruin someone's life in the process, even if they express odious views, is probably a bit better. I think the better way, rather than just getting someone fired, is maybe approaching them, having a conversation with them and saying, here's why I disagree with you, and trying to change their mind. Because if you get them fired, more than anything, you're probably going to instill this persecution mentality in them and make them dig in their heels even further than they were before they uttered that opinion.
Let's go back to the founding and the founders. Were the founders genius in that they recognized that protecting free speech should only apply to government protection, and on the private side, the marketplace of ideas? If an employer fires someone, then maybe their customers won't use that business or patronize it, or maybe they'll patronize it more. Were the founders ingenious in their thinking there, or did they just get lucky?
Maybe a bit of both. I'm a strong believer that the 55 men who met at Philadelphia, if you tried to pull off something like that today, I don't see how we would be successful. I think it would just end up collapsing into chaos. Not that they were perfect men, not that they didn't have blind spots, but I tell my students the United States has a lot of problems. There are many things that we could do better on, but the one thing that I truly believe that we do better than any other country on earth is our approach to free speech. And I do think that there is most certainly a difference between the private sector and the public realm. If you are being criminally prosecuted, you're not just having your livelihood taken away. You could potentially be fined. You could potentially be incarcerated. In the private sector, if you lose your job, there is always another job out there. Someone will eventually end up employing you. I do think the idea of imposing the same type of restrictions on the private sector in regard to government activity when it comes to restricting speech, I would be very hesitant to apply that. I do think the Founding Fathers, when they met for the first time in Philadelphia after the Constitution was ratified and introduced that First Amendment, I really think it was a visionary and, for its time, completely unprecedented radical proposition.
Robert Bolton, Fairmont State University political science professor. Robert, what's been your students' reaction to all of this over the last several days? What are they talking about?
Yeah, I will say, compared to, I think, what you see on TikTok or YouTube, most of my students have their feet pretty firmly planted on the ground. I am a little bit more optimistic when I talk to them than when I read the newspaper nationwide. There's a variety of opinions, but I will say that it seems like everyone in my classrooms, I haven't talked to them one-on-one, every one of them, but it seems like all of them recognize that this was a horrendous murder. Some of them do have a little bit more skeptical approach in regard to what we alluded to earlier about whether or not we should prosecute hate speech, but most of them do seem to understand that you need to be very careful about that because your side will not always be in power. Eventually there will be an election that you lose, and you better hope that the other side doesn't use the same tools that you used against them just for speech. Just my personal observation.
So do you feel like we're doing a good enough job then of educating our kids about the Constitution, about their rights?
Oh, heavens, no. Absolutely not. No.
I figured you would go with that.
No, and again, my students are probably better off than a lot of people in this country. There's a statistic I like telling people, and this is true. If you asked the average American to name all 5 rights protected in the First Amendment, only 3% of Americans can do that today. And that isn't just me, some old man with my pants hiked up high saying kids these days. That's true across the board. Very few young people take the time to read the Constitution. It's very rarely taught in class today in a meaningful way. I have a good friend over in Grafton, Rich, who teaches the high school civics class, and he invites me to speak in most years, and I give a talk on the Bill of Rights. And he's one of the few teachers I know who really takes the initiative to do something like that. When you look at broader levels of knowledge among Americans, it seems like most people don't understand what their first, their Fourth, their Fifth, their Sixth Amendment rights, and that to me is very discouraging. I tell people I do not think the younger generation is dumber. I am not one of those people. I don't think that they're lazier, but I do find that they generally are more distracted than maybe some of the older generations. And I think part of that's technology. In some ways, the internet, which was supposed to be the information superhighway, and it can be an amazingly beneficial tool, has ultimately kind of devolved into this giant distraction most of the time for them.
Robert Bolton, Fairmont State University political science professor, friend of the show. Always appreciate your insights. Thanks for coming on with us today.
Always appreciate being on. Great talking with you, too.
You as well. Robert Bolton, Fairmont State University political science professor. We'll get in a couple of texts. 304-TALK-304. Gino Shirelli joins us bottom of the hour, Montague County delegate. This is Talkline from the